Firstly, why? Why have I, among others, spent the last decade championing improved outcomes from sepsis? Well, for me, it's a very personal reason. It's because I watched this young man on the left die 2 weeks after this photograph was taken. His name was Jem. His wife, Karen, remains a good friend. Tom and Emily are now grown up and at university. But we'd missed opportunities to rescue Jem, both in the community. GPs had missed opportunities to examine him. Paramedics had missed opportunities to transfer him to hospital. Both had missed opportunities to safety net him. And then in my hospital, we missed the opportunity to question why this 37-year-old man had had a cardiac arrest in our emergency department and to wonder whether it might have been an infective origin. So the moment at which I thought we need to fix this was following Karen down the hospital corridor, knowing I was about to take this young woman into the relatives interview room to tell her that her fit, strong husband wasn't coming home. And she was going to have to go home and tell Tom and Emily that Daddy wasn't coming home, all from a condition that I dealt with day in, day out, but they'd never heard of. And it's a huge problem. Now, the data aren't perfect, but we conservatively estimate that sepsis has about 150,000 episodes in the UK every year and accounts for approximately 44,000 lives lost, which the headline figure is it's more than breast cancer and bowel cancer and prostate cancer combined. Of course, some of these patients will have comorbidities, including probably those cancers, but it's a huge problem. The data is imperfect. It's born from data held by the Office for National Statistics and the Health and Social Care Information Centre, but it's corroborated. Our estimates are corroborated and are probably conservative by data from the Centre for Disease Control in the US, who have rather better data. So we think it's about 44,000 lives. It might be as high as 65,000 lives, but it's certainly big. We've taught life or death, and we celebrate survival and we commiserate death, and we question whether we could have done better. But the reality is that for sepsis survivors, like this young woman, recovery can be problematic. They don't bounce back after we discharge them from hospital and go about their daily business. This is one of many slides I could have shown you. Post-traumatic stress disorder, another one, in about a fifth of survivors. Now, we doctors like to quote statistics, we like to challenge each other, we like to look clever, but I'd like you to think about what this actually means. What does cognitive impairment mean in 1 in 5 survivors? It means you can't return to work at your previous level of function. It means you might not be able to return to work at all. If you're self-employed, critical illness cover won't cover you for sepsis. It means that relationships are strained. It means that relationships break down. It means that people lose their home. And this is the big burden of sepsis. And I'd ask you to take a leap of faith with me, that we know that giving the basics, the sepsis 6 if you like, reduces the maximum acuity of illness. It stops patients getting worse. This is a study demonstrating that from 11 hospitals in the US. Now, we know that if you stay in intensive care for more than 7 days, you have a higher likelihood of these long-term sequelae. So the leap of faith I'd like to take with me is if we do take sepsis seriously, recognise it early, intervene rapidly, then we might reduce the long-term burden of disease, both to the individual and the fiscal burden to our economy. I think it's really important that we talk about definitions of sepsis because these have changed. We've got 2 new things this year. We've got a new international definition of sepsis, and then you've got a new NICE clinical guideline, which has essentially ignored the new international definition of sepsis. So we'll look at that and try and unpick it a bit. This is what we used to think happened. We used to think that sepsis followed a nice clinical course that was predictable, and it started with a bit of inflammation, and then organs started to fail, and if you're unlucky, that organ, one of those organs would be your circulatory system. And we looked at cohort mortality rates, and we know that getting an infection is not a terrible place to be. We all have infections on a monthly basis almost. That if you develop sepsis, your cohort mortality is 10%, and if you develop the most severe end septic shock, your cohort mortality is 50%. Actually, if you throw in an acute kidney injury and a need for ventilation with septic shock, your cohort mortality is more like 70%. But we had a problem with this convenient continuum. We didn't know who was going to respond in which way. And just as Bill Gates unscrewed the lid of a jar of mosquitoes in a TED auditorium and said something along the lines of, we don't know whether these carry malaria or not, why should poor people have all the fun? We don't know. If I were to inoculate every one of you with lipopolysaccharide, which is very good at bringing about sepsis, then some of you would follow that continuum. Some of you would be moribund within hours, and some of you would have a self-limiting clinical course, and we don't know who's going to respond in which way. So at present, all we can do is give antimicrobials and restore the circulation and control the source of infection. And when we had people like Anand Kumar telling us that for every hour we delay in administering antibiotics and septic shock, the risk of death goes up by 7.6%, together with the fact that we can't predict who's going to respond in what way, I can understand why I was starting to see care pathways from organisations who were intervening with broad-spectrum antibiotics at the stage of uncomplicated sepsis, SIRS plus infection. Bad and wrong and not evidence-based. So we had a problem. And we knew we had to do something about it. So we started moving forward, the International Consensus Definitions Group started moving forward, and NICE started thinking about how they were going to define it. And we were all looking for the same thing. We were all looking for that badness that means you need the broad-spectrum antimicrobials. So the new definitions have dropped the term severe sepsis. You either have an infection or you have sepsis. And of course what that means is there's a great big gap of people, a chasm of people who have infection, who don't yet fulfill the new definition of sepsis, but still might need hospital assessment and might need antimicrobials. So while all this was being considered by the clever people, we did our usual back-of-the-fag packet stuff. And we said, well, what have we got to identify people who might be sick? We've got NEWS, the National Early Warning Score. So let's look at the parameter thresholds in NEWS that score 3, and we will use that as a surrogate for the official definition of sepsis, because we know it's not very good. And we spoke to the Royal Colleges, we spoke to NHS England, and everyone seemed to think that this was a relatively sensible approach. Then Mervyn came along. Mervyn Singer, Professor of Critical Care at Imperial College London, very charismatic, incredibly bright, brain the size of a planet, and he defined sepsis with his group. And he looked at this new thing called CUSO as a bedside test. Now, I don't really want you to take much notice of CUSO at the moment, and I will explain why. CUSO uses the parameters that are within the National Early Warning Score, altered mental state, tachypnea, and hypotension. If you look at the data behind these international consensus studies, they should have also included lactate in CUSO because lactate individually predicted adverse outcome as well. But the thresholds are different to NEWS, which made it operationally very difficult for the UK. And NICE became aware of this. NICE knew it was going to be a challenge to introduce the new international definitions. So they looked at red flag sepsis, these things that we'd come up with on the back of a fag packet, and there's going to be a couple of formatting issues for which I apologise, and they went through them one by one. And so the NICE definition of sepsis is hypotension. The changes from red flag sepsis are highlighted in red. High lactate, tachycardia, tachypnea, oxygen saturations, they've changed it a bit, altered mental state, purulent rash, added a bit of narrative around that, and not pass urine for 18 hours. So these are the high-risk criteria in the new NICE clinical guideline, and it's these criteria, because they fit with the National Early Warning Score, because we can measure them at the bedside, that the UK Sepsis Trust, the RCGP, the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, the Royal College of Physicians, blah, 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 and NHS England and NICE would recommend you use to trigger a mandated response for urgent antimicrobials. So only these. And what that's meant is that we can create a load of tools. So if you want to have a look on our website under clinical toolkits, there is a toolkit for your clinical environment. So general practice, pre-hospital services, community services, emergency departments, inpatients, etc. And we have tools for children and young people over 12 years, for pregnant women, for children under 5, and for children 5 to 11 years, for each clinical area. And we start with a concern, we validate it with a suspicion of infection, and then if we've got a red flag, we say you're going to go in and treat. What NICE have done is they've added in these things called amber flags. They've added in the moderate risk criteria, which, confidentially, just between us, I don't think add a lot of value. I would question whether those amber flags add value over and above, no, there's no red flag, but the patient looks sick or the relative's a bit worried. Because I think in those situations, we can justify the response of that, which is use your clinical judgment, get a senior decision maker to the patient. We've worked with GPs, we've got these toolkits embedded in their informatics system. So GPs are now encouraged to screen for sepsis. They're encouraged to think about doing some observations. They're encouraged to think about a source of infection, particularly when patients have any risk factors. And GPs should start to pre-alert and bring patients in using the terminology red flag sepsis. Intervention, well, the Sepsis 6 hasn't changed much since we created it in 2005. We've gone a bit softer on the oxygen. We've gone a bit harder on sampling. Still got the antibiotics in there. We've said you now need to monitor serial lactates because that is important. And if after delivering the Sepsis 6 the patient's still unwell, this is directly from NICE, then you call critical care and get critical care down. Obviously, we need an app. So we've got an app that will be released relatively shortly. But I just want to finish by talking about our approach to fixing the system. And if the AV people are listening, just a reminder to turn the volume off, please. This is a meta-analysis of when things have been done well. It's a meta-analysis that does not show that in any situation where sustained change and improvement was seen, I put a poster up or I wrote a policy. It shows investment. It shows investment in people, in resources, in education. It shows organisational learning and organisations taking it seriously. We have something of an obsession with the airline industry in healthcare. We look at how pilots use checklists. We presume that if we learn from the airline industry, we will have a safe healthcare system. That's fine for elective stuff, because what happens if the airplane's not safe? Well, it doesn't take off. We can't do that for emergency situations. Not taking off is not an option. So we have to start learning from other industries. And there are analogies with several industries. 1950 Indianapolis Grand Prix. This car went on to win the race in what was then a world record-breaking pit stop time of 59 seconds. And I'm sorry, the streaming isn't working very well, so we might have to move on. But this world record-breaking team didn't rest on their laurels. The very next race, the narrative goes that the guy at the back there, the guy down at the bottom, said, well, why have we only got one guy changing both wheels? And the reality is that they'd never needed one guy changing each front wheel before, because the length of time it took to refuel and clean the windscreen and give the driver his cup of tea with a nip of brandy or whatever took too long. But now that they've got all the other stuff better, they now needed another person on the front wheel. So we had a team of highly motivated, highly trained health professionals working together as a team, understanding what we had to do to improve. Now, if the streaming were better, we'd now be on the 2013 Grand Prix with a Ferrari pit stop that was 2.9 seconds. Now, nobody is saying that we need to deliver antibiotics in 2.9 seconds or 2.9 minutes in sepsis. We don't know that 30 minutes is better than an hour. We don't know that an hour is better than 75 minutes. What we do know is that in industries where urgent intervention is delivered rapidly and where we've seen sustained improvement, we have people training together as teams, we have people who are task-focused, we have investment in equipment, training, education and improvement. And if we're going to get better at sepsis, that investment, Philip talked about investment as a result of the sequin. We know that trusts, acute trusts, don't invest sequin money. Typically, they invest about 8 to 10% of the pot that they receive from a sequin because it's a backdoor incentive. So we need to think about better commissioning. We have a job as a sepsis trust. We have a job to make all of this easy. We can design some sexy posters. We can do some education. And obviously, that's all going ahead. We have a job to support people affected by sepsis. Some of you may have seen the little story of William Mead, the boy who died of sepsis just after his first birthday. And his mum has been on television, across the channels, promoting heightened awareness of sepsis. That's made a certain friend of ours stand up and listen. And look, I'm not employed by NHS England, so I have the luxury of being able to say what I want. But this man, I actually genuinely think cares about patient safety. I think he's genuinely moved by Melissa Mead's story and the loss of William Mead. And now he's said things on public record that I can hold him to account over. So we will start to see improvement in sepsis. We will start to see change. One thing that we're going to be announcing next week is that the Cabinet Office, please don't tweet this, because we'll upset them, are highly likely to sign off on a public awareness campaign for sepsis. It won't be at the scale of the FAST campaign, and it's going to look a bit like this. It's going to look a little bit like an association with a feature film that's coming out in October. We're going to use that as a springboard to start to get the message out there. You won't be able to read, but I don't watch Downton Abbey, but Joanne Froggatt's the lead actress in that film. It's an astonishing film. Go and see it. We're working with partners, HSBC, O2, Vodafone, etc., to get mail shop flyers out there and electronic flyers out there. And we've got to safety net. So we have safety netting for adults. We have safety netting for children. This is a leaflet derived from an earlier resource in the Southwest that simply signposts parents. So this is a safety net. It's delivered by a health professional with an explanatory language around it, and it tells parents and guides them as to what they do. That's going into child personal health records. So I'd just like to finish my pitch, if you like. We've talked a bit of clinical stuff and then I've pitched about what we do. But we aim to save 14,000 lives, not the 11,000 in England. This is across the UK and the British Isles. Just to remind you what that looks like, that will look like, and we've lost a slide, that will look like the entire stand on the long axis of that football stadium being saved every single year, which is more lives than if we stopped anyone dying from bowel cancer. Again, apologies for the formatting issues. That clearly is sepsistrust.org. Thank you very much.